there's no question that plastic pollution is one of the plagues of our time. It's affecting every human endeavor. I could argue that, in fact, economically, the cost is in the multiple billions per year in terms of what it's doing. But more to the point, I think, is the impact that it has on biodiversity, wildlife in particular, and on human health. So increasingly, we're finding that the human body is riddled with nanoplastic. And it's really been so ubiquitous that we've discovered it in rain clouds, in mountains. It's, of course, polluting the oceans at a great rate, and therefore the fish. And then because of the food chain, it's impacting all sorts of wildlife. But human beings are consuming fish as well, as we know. There are many other ways that humans are exposed to plastic on a daily basis. And so there's big concerns now about whether or not it's having a deleterious impact on human lifespan, human mental development, and many other areas. I'm a member of the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty. This is a group of, now I think we're well over 200 scientists from around the world. I come at it from a social science perspective, but most of my colleagues are chemists or other so-called natural scientists. We want to ensure that the treaty is effective. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't just mean that a bunch of countries have signed an agreement. It means that we've got a treaty that can actually live and breathe over the years, that it has scientific authority behind it, and to that end, we're very interested in ensuring that there's a efficient and effective science policy interface, is what we call it. This is similar to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, with which I do extensive work as well. So we want something similar, but for plastics, because it's not going to be enough just for states to sign on and say, we promise that we will try to reduce our plastic pollution in the future. We need hard limits. And then this is the most difficult aspect of these negotiations. It's one thing to say that we will try to curtail the pollution that results from the distribution and use of plastic in society. It's another thing, however, to say that we will put limits on plastic production. And this is the real sticking point. This is where some countries are just refusing, I think, to budge. Although there's sort of a groundswell, I think, of public opinion globally that something needs to be done. Not everyone agrees that one of those things is that we need to either stop or severely limit plastic production, right? And you can understand why if you realize that most of the plastics that we use are derived from fossil fuels. So countries such as Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United States, other major oil producing states are tending to drag on this. It's absolutely essential. And I can give you a good example here. If we are only concerned with measuring plastic pollution, and even with measuring its impact on, let's say, human health, right? We can't overlook the additional element of human behavior and the need for social science to understand why plastic is as ubiquitous as it is, why it's so widely used, what sort of policies are in place to curtail the plastic waste that's out there, which are significant. There's been quite a few advances made here in terms of plastic bag bans, for example, and other things. Clearly, it's not enough. Plastic pollution is still accumulating at an alarming rate. So there's an effort, I think, it's very important to understand that we need to involve social science when we're looking at this. We need to understand what patterns of human behavior are affecting the plastic pollution problem. Beyond that, though, this is really an all hands on deck situation, I think, as many environmental problems are, right? Same with climate, biodiversity, other issues. So we need the people that are looking at the chemistry. We need people that are looking at the biology, and we need people that are looking at the policy impacts, at even the philosophical side. The humanities are often overlooked, but there's a lot of wonderful literature that's come out, describing plastic, for example, as one of the main markings of the Anthropocene, right? This era that we've entered, where human beings are leaving an indelible impact on the planet. What does that mean in terms of how we think about ourselves as human beings? How does that affect culture? So these are issues that are often overlooked, and we don't talk about them too explicitly in plastic treaty negotiations, or even in plastic policy usually. But it's sort of a subtext, if you will, to understanding the nature and the magnitude of the problem. It's hard to overstate the ubiquity of plastics today, right? I mean, everything you see, touch, feel, that you're going to end up coming against plastic every day of your life. And there's different reasons why that's evolved in terms of the political economy of the history of plastic production. I already mentioned fossil fuel production, and that's a big part of it. Moving forward, we need economists that are concerned about these issues as well, because obviously, if we can't convince politicians that they need to take these steps and that they won't be deleterious to their economy, they won't take these steps on their own. Right? But there's lots of evidence out there suggesting that reducing plastic production will not destroy our economies, but we need economists to back that up. It's really important to understand that, like any other commodity, plastic has a life cycle. It doesn't just begin with that plastic bottle that you see lying on the street. Right? In fact, the plastic production life cycle begins with extraction. It begins with the extraction of fossil fuels. Right? So there's a very strong tie-in here with climate change. Clearly, any policy that overlooks that aspect of it is ignoring a great part of not only the problem in itself, but also the human rights impacts associated with the extraction of fossil fuels. Then you have to look at the actual production of plastic, which has all sorts of deleterious impacts on the environment. And we need strong governments that are willing to say that we're going to limit production at source. Right? This is something we've been trying to get in place for many years. The Plastics Treaty might help us get there, but I'm not too optimistic, especially given the current configuration of political actors that are involved in the negotiations. But there are some countries in Africa, in Europe, and elsewhere that have been very strong advocates for such an approach. Right? A strong effort to limit production is essential. Right? The argument that we need to keep producing more and more and more plastic instead of reusing what we already have, recycling, and so on, is I think the only one that makes sense in the long term if you look at the magnitude of this issue. That being said, there are all sorts of other policies that can be put in place, such as the bans on plastic bags, bans on plastic straws. And I know these things can get sometimes exaggerated in terms of, that these are the solutions. They are not. I think I've made that clear. But they're very important too. I mean, they send a strong message to the public that we should be very careful with how we utilize plastic and how much of it we demand in the marketplace. And it's also, I think, quite effective in trying to push us towards new innovative solutions, right? Whether that's reusing or effective recycling. Now, recycling we can talk about all day, but the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of plastic does not get recycled. A lot of the plastic that ends up in your recycling box, in fact, does go overseas. And in some cases, when it gets there, it's not dealt with adequately. In some cases, it's just put into landfills and or it's actually burned, which is a very big problem, especially for the local population and workers. Here's another issue that many people don't think about, but The plastics waste industry is massive, it's global. There's been a historically imperialistic pattern to this, right, where plastic waste has been shipped to lower income countries or colonized countries. And in many cases, one can argue this is exacerbating the problem because a lot of this plastic gets lost in transport as well, and adds to the total of pollution. We need to be very stalwart when it comes to enforcing plastic trade limitations, right? And there are separate debates going on there in the World Trade Organization that will overlap with the treaty as well. Then there's the simple, as I said earlier, the use of plastic itself in your daily life. It's something that we all have a responsibility, I think, to limit. You won't get rid of it entirely. Right? There's plastic fibers in your clothes, right? I mean, it's very difficult to do that. But there are things that individuals can do that'll be helpful. I'd like to see a treaty that Canada signs on to, obviously. Canada actually hosted one of the treaty intergovernmental negotiations. And this was last year, right, which didn't get us to where we wanted to be. Subsequently, there was a meeting in Korea. This summer, there will be a meeting in Geneva where we're hoping the treaty will actually get passed. I'd like to see Canada sign on to a strong treaty and be proud of that. And that should filter through to provincial policies and municipal policies in terms of what our obligations are, right? In terms of limiting the contribution to the problem that we're all making. I think university campuses are well placed to try and limit plastic consumption on campus. I know we're trying to do a good job on that. So when you have clean-up days, and this affects, of course, beaches and forests and rivers, and but also university campuses, right, where we can actually clean up the plastic that's out there. That's wonderful. But a great deal of it too is purchasing, right? So are we using plastic water bottles on campus, for example, right? Something to explore. Most university campuses have looked at this issue, of course, and there's pressure to not limit that sort of purchasing, but overall it's been effective in many places. So it's a question of what is the university bringing in, and how are people utilizing it when it's here? I think that's very important. Another thing that universities can do, though, is what we're doing right now, right, which is talking about the problem. Universities are good as talking places. That's what I think one of their main functions is in society. So events, public symposiums, I think this sort of educative mission of the university is important.